that challenge? Have you ever had the challenge of feeling engaged in a class as a student? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Last question. For faculty, have you ever been challenged not knowing if your students are reading the assigned reading or essentially doing what you're asking of them as far as the course requirements? Ever had that challenge? Yeah? All right. Well, I can certainly say that I've had those challenges as an instructor, and as a student, I've had some of those same challenges. Some of the ways that I've addressed those challenges I'll talk about here today as part of my presentation, which is emerging evidence-based teaching technologies in higher education, implications for research and practice. I'll be talking about a very specific evidence-based teaching method known as interteaching. So just as a I can advance the slide. Okay, so as an overview, we're going to talk about four major areas: traditional behavioral teaching methods, interteaching and its key components, some current interteaching research and practice, and then finally future areas of research and practice as it relates specifically to interteaching. So first, we're going to talk about traditional teaching methods, typically known as lecture. I like to think of lecture has been referred to as the Velveeta of teaching method, which you're wondering what the heck that means. Me being from Wisconsin, I like to talk about cheese, and the reason why is that lecture is the Velveeta teaching methods is because typically when they've done surveys of what's your favorite cheese, people say cheddar, they say Swiss, but they never say Velveeta, when in reality Velveeta is the most popular cheese consumed. So as it relates to this, people or instructors are asked what kind of teaching method do you use. Hardly ever do they say lecture. I use lecture all the time. That's my main teaching method. But in reality, 80 to 85% of college instructors do in fact lecture. Now, lecture, if you listen to some of the talks here, certainly has its place. Over lunch, the keynote talked about the role of lecture and the relationship, and in terms of disseminating content, it certainly has many benefits. But it also has been shown to have little interaction at times between student and instructor, often engages in students are engaged in passive learning, and it's also known as a somewhat ineffective teaching method. So the teaching method I'll be using does in fact involve lecture, so I'm not discounting or discrediting lecture as an ineffective teaching method, just saying that it can have its challenges. Okay, so as an alternative to lecture, there's been a lot of research over the years on behavioral teaching methods that capitalize on well-established principles of learning, maximizing the effectiveness of reinforcement. Here are four very evidence-based teaching methods: precision teaching, personalized system of instruction, program learning, direct instruction. In the interest of time, I don't have time to describe each of these in detail. But just know that these are some common features of behavioral teaching methods in particular. Typically, they use positive reinforcement instead of any kind of aversive consequences. They also focus on mastery, so learning a particular content area before moving on to the next. Also, performance is assessed frequently, so there's small, frequent assessments of performance instead of one big, huge lecture at the end, or a final exam at the end of the semester, for example. And then typically, presentation materials moves from simple to complex. So first maybe learning simple definitions or terms, and then using that information, then generalizing it to larger, more involving concepts. So what are some possible reasons? There has been a lot since the 1950s or earlier when behavioral teaching methods have been utilized in academic settings. There's been some reasons for the lack of behavioral teaching methods, and here are some. Typically, they produce high grades, which I think is a good thing, but for administrators, if everybody got a 4.0 here at UMass Boston, that could be problematic in terms of, are you challenging the students enough? But as that is the intent of behavioral teaching methods, is to the mastery component. Habit for many students or instructors, if they've used lecture, that's how they learned when they were a student. You use what you know. Time constraints. Behavioral teaching methods often at first can be more time-consuming for those of you that are faculty, tenure track, you have other research, service expectations, devoting a significant amount of time to teaching can be problematic. Student resistance. Some students, they really learn well with, they know lecture, so mixing it up and having a disruptive teaching method could lead to some resistance. Instructors hesitant to give up control usually behavioral teaching methods. Instead of the sage on the stage, it's a guide on the side. That's how I've been described it and like to think of it as. And then finally, misunderstanding of behavioral principles. So potential use of, or people thinking that you're using aversive technology or procedures versus reinforcement, for example, or confusing bribery and reinforcement. Those are some common misunderstandings of behavioral principles. Yes?
This is a question. Again,
sure.
Looking at that slide, I just had an experience. It was at Auburn University.
Uh-huh.
We had one of the core courses was taught. Yes, I read master, maybe 90 every week.
Right.
Every take.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm not great. You earn out of it by the end of it, but you also get a lot of interviews.
Yeah.
And what happened there was 1,400 students per course.
Wow.
Two things happened. That number of students getting high grades, it looked like grade inflation.
Right.
So the university actually came down.
Right. That's, yeah.
The other thing is one semester had 250.
Wow. So it sounds like you're on either end of the spectrum, either total mastery or close to that, or not finishing, to completion. More of an administrative thing, but a real issue in academia. All right, so I'm going to highlight Interteaching, which is the major behavioral teaching method that I'm going to be talking about here today. It's a fairly new behavioral teaching method that I like to think of as taking the best of all the previous behavioral teaching methods and taking its best features and that are most conducive to a college classroom and a very user-friendly alternative to some of the other behavioral teaching methods. So it's known as a mutually probing, mutually informing conversation between two people. It's considered to be a little bit more flexible than previous behavioral teaching methods. Requires active learning, and I like to think of like that the core of interteaching is the best way to learn something is to teach it to somebody else. And for those of you that have ever taught before, you certainly know that if you want to know information well, teach it. And if you, in the process of teaching it, you're going to certainly know that information well. And that's kind of really what interteaching in a nutshell is intended to do. So what are the key components? There's 6 key components. I'll describe each of those in a little bit of detail here. The first is what's called a preparation guide or a prep guide. I like to think is like a study guide. That question I asked, if you recall at the beginning of the presentation about knowing what you're expected to read, the prep guide does a good job of, say you have an assigned reading, of saying, okay, these are questions that correspond with that assigned reading and are really the important information that the instructor wants that student to know. They're also used as a basis for what's called pair discussion, and pair discussion is kind of the core component of interteaching in that students are having a dyadic discussion. So let's just say Judy and I were in an interteaching session. Her and I would be having a discussion of the prep guide, which is based on the assigned reading. And they've previously done interteaching where it was with 4 or 5 people in a group, but they found that a dyad was the best because there's no hiding. It's just you and the other person. Even having that third person, that third person might not be discussing and interacting to the same degree as others. Here's an example of a prep guide, which is basically just a Word document with a list of related questions. In the interest of time, we can't really go over this entire thing, but know that these questions build on each other. Like if you remember, I mentioned that it should go from simple to complex. So the questions down here should be based on the more definitional term questions that were up here, and there's more application type questions down below. This is available, for example, classes here at UMass Boston in which I've used this, available on Blackboard or hard copy, whether it's online or on campus format. So the remaining components of interteaching. The third is a record sheet. A record sheet is what students submit. So if you're following me, during the interteaching session, students read the assigned reading, they come to class prepared with the prep guide, they have a pair discussion, then they fill out what's called a record sheet. And a record sheet gives feedback to me as the instructor on what the students found interesting, what they found difficult, what they want to talk about in more detail. And so it's a way for them to give feedback to me on their discussions. It's also a way, there's a social contingency too, because you can ask questions, and here's just an example of a record sheet. You can ask them about the duration of their discussion. What was the quality of their discussion? Was it high quality on a scale of 1 to 10? What did you find most difficult, most interesting? Those are typical questions of a record sheet. And this record sheet could look differently. It can be adjusted to whatever the instructor wants it to, or the information that they want it to obtain. So going back to the components, the next component of interteaching is a clarifying lecture. A clarifying lecture follows the pair discussion, so it should function as a reinforcer because it's after the pair discussion. And what the clarifying lecture is it's a lecture, it's just not the entire class, and it's intended to be based on the information that the students gave the instructor from the record sheet, if you're following me. So what I tell students is like, let's just say we had a pair discussion in class today, and we got another class next week. I'll tell the students, I don't know what the clarifying lecture is going to consist of because I'm waiting for you to give me that information. So I don't determine what the lecture is. You guys, as the students, make that, that lecture yourselves. And it's intended to just clarify and discuss topics that were difficult or interesting from the previous class. Okay, so the final two components of interteaching include tests, or referred to as probes. Typically these are, it could be essay questions, true, false, multiple choice, however the instructor would want to devise them. More importantly, you want to have typically frequent tests, which is a common feature of behavioral teaching methods, where you have small, like what I do actually with my interteach is I have a small quiz at the end of every interteaching session, which also is intended to capitalize on the testing effect, which says that the more that you are tested, the more likely you are to learn and obtain the information. And the final component, the component that really makes interteaching, I think, I mean, they're all together, in combination would make it work. But the final component is what's called quality points, which are intended to enhance the quality of the discussion. They're also considered an explicit cooperative contingency, which basically means that back to like Judy and I were having a pair discussion. If I do a really good job of teaching material to her, and in turn she teaches it to me, ideally we're both going to have a quality discussion, learn the material, and as a result, if we take a quiz and we both score a score of, say, 80% or higher, then we both receive quality points. So her behavior and my behavior are contingent on one another. Does that make sense? And the percentage in which as the instructor were to award quality points can vary, and there's been some recent research that's indicated that that percentage, or how you structure the delivery of quality points, certainly makes a big difference. Okay, so moving on, and I know we don't have a lot of time, so if I'm going a little fast, it's just because we have an abbreviated time frame. I did want to highlight the first study that was done at Interteaching, which was done by the first author, Brian Seville. And what he did was he wanted to know, first, like most good research, it should be done in a laboratory setting where you have more control over extraneous variables. So what he did is he looked at, basically, from what I can recall from the articles, or the publication, was that he had a pretty arbitrary article about dogs and like animal therapy, and so he had students read this article. It could be on any topic really, and then what he did is he examined. He gave them a quiz, and so there were 4 conditions. Either a control condition where they're just basically told to go in a room and take a quiz with no exposure to anything. Then he had a reading condition where they just intended to read the article, okay, and then get quizzed on it. The third condition group had a lecture, and basically what they did is got a lecture on the topic. And then the fourth group had that condition was interteaching. As you can see here, the author gave me permission to utilize the data here for presentation here. The percentage of questions answered correctly out of 100, you can see that about almost 75% of the students in the interteaching group, or the average percentage was 75% of questions answered correctly, the highest of the 4 conditions during the interteaching section. So the control group is basically, they were just given an article. Like if I gave you the article, I didn't lecture on it, we didn't have an interteaching, I just gave you an article. Or actually, I'm sorry, I just gave you a quiz with no article, no instruction, just a quiz, and you'd had no prior exposure to anything. That's the control condition, essentially. Yeah, yeah. So they could have had some previous knowledge on therapy for pet therapy or something. But as you can see, I mean, they did the interteaching section, which is what the authors or the researchers hypothesized that in the interteaching section they would that group would score the highest, and which is what was the case. As one more bit of data. Same authors, some of the same authors, they wanted to know, is interteaching effective in the classrooms? Here was the first examination with 31 undergrads. They used an alternating treatments design where they had some classes throughout the semester that were interteaching and some that were lecture. And they used counterbalancing, which is a really effective and powerful design in which you have, on the same day, for example, you have one section exposed to one condition and the other section exposed to the other condition. So that counterbalancing is really useful. And here's the data for the two different sections. Notice that the data on the bottom below is lecture and up top is interteaching. Again, this was the mean or the average test scores from 0 to 100. Notice that interteaching in a college classroom, those students that were exposed to interteaching scored higher on these tests between these two sections. So, and here's also a percentage of questions. This is total cumulative questions between the two sections. Section 1 in the black, Section 2 in the white. Overall, the percentage of questions was higher with interteaching versus lecture. So some empirical evidence that interteaching is an effective method of promoting learning. So I just wanted to also note that there's been, currently my colleagues have under review, literature review devoted to interteaching, and we look at all the different applications over the last 10 plus years of empirical support for interteaching. And here's just some examples of the different settings or populations in which interteaching has been researched. Just noting that. So in the time that we have, I just want to highlight a couple studies that my colleagues and I have recently completed, and are either under review or they're completed and published. The first is replication. What we wanted to do was that first, or the second study that I showed you, which was the first study conducted in a college classroom. We wanted to replicate that study in a rehabilitation education class, and specifically the dependent measure was the impact of teaching method on student learning and satisfaction. So this was a medical aspects disability course, 41 undergraduate students, 2 sections, 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, met on Tuesdays and Thursdays for 75 minutes. Those were our that was our target population. We did is similar to the other study. We had an alternating treatments design where prior to the start of the study we randomly selected the course to either be interteaching or lecture. And we also used the counterbalancing. So whatever the morning class was exposed to, the afternoon got the other teaching method. And we also had daily testing at the end of every class, whether it was lecture or interteaching. They received a small quiz. And then they also received immediate feedback, which was another thing that has been noted is a general rule of thumb. The closer in time they receive feedback after gauging the behavior, the better. And so we wanted to give them as much or as immediate a feedback as possible on their quiz performance. So here, in the interest of time, I'm just going to throw up the procedures. So in the interteaching section, they were given a prep guide made available for class. With the lecture section, no prep guide. They received points for either engaging in pair discussion or a PowerPoint lecture. Administered a test after each, and then there was no quality points available, or there was quality points available for interteaching, but not for lecture, just because they're not working with another student during lecture. And those quality points were not part of, I'll explain that here in a minute. Here's the data. This is specific for section 1, which was the morning section, in which you'll note that the light blue is the interteaching section, and or the interteaching methods, and then the dark blue is the traditional lecture. And this was a quiz out of 10 points. You'll notice that there was some overlapping data, which is what you don't want, but there, generally speaking, there was higher quiz scores during the interteaching section than in lecture. And here is section 2, which has some less than favorable data, which I'll explain here in a minute, as possible reasons. But this is the data specifically for section 2. Also, cumulative percentage of questions answered correctly between interteaching and lecture. Okay, so we also at the end of the semester asked a social validity question. It was 2 very simple questions. Which teaching method did you prefer, either interteaching, lecture, or that you didn't have a preference? And then also, which teaching method did you feel that you learned more, interteaching, lecture, and no preference? You can see there's a slightly higher preference for interteaching and a higher indication that students felt like they learned more with interteaching. So social validity measure is an additional dependent measure. A couple of points to note on this study. Overall, students prefer interteaching, as I mentioned. There was contrasting results, such as the average quiz performance for section 1 with the interteaching was higher, but unfortunately, contrary to our hypothesis for section 2, the average quiz performance was higher with lecture. My colleagues and I have a couple of reasons why we speculated that might be the case. One is the difference between students in each section. Just on a side note, the students in the morning section were typically the freshmen and the sophomore because that was an 8 o'clock in the morning class, and they were the last ones to have the opportunity to register. Whereas the students in the afternoon class, which is the 3 o'clock class, the more preferred class for many of the students, they were the ones that were able to register for that class first. So you got one section mainly undergrads, or underclassmen, the other section mainly upperclassmen. Also, the difference between quizzes for each section, unfortunately due to the potential for academic dishonesty, where the students in the morning section say, hey, this is what's going to be on the quiz, I had to make the quizzes slightly different than the afternoon section. Wanted to make them as close as possible to the, in terms of the same challenge and rigor, but inevitably a different quiz. Possible correlation between GPA and performance in interteaching. It's possible that students that might, regardless of being upperclassmen, underclassmen, which section did they choose to enroll in? Maybe that's a different type of student. Therefore, it could perform differently. These are some plausible points that we made in our discussion. All right, so I'm going to really breeze through these next 2 studies, but there's been a number of recent interteaching publications that have looked at what are called component analyses. Component analyses are basically trying to determine which component of interteaching is having the most effect, which component is really making the biggest difference in terms of the student's learning satisfaction. So what we wanted to do was look at quality points as one component and manipulate that particular component to see what impact it was having on students' learning. We also, previous quality points, component analyses of quality points, one of the biggest issues was back to that immediacy. They received, they learned if they met the quality point continuously, but it wasn't until maybe a week later, so it was too delayed in time. So we wanted to enhance that immediacy of the delivery of reinforcement. So this was a small study of just 11 undergraduate students in an introductory applied behavior analysis class. It met on Mondays and Wednesdays for 75 minutes. Very similar alternating treatments with no counterbalancing because it was only one section. We can have the opportunity to counterbalance. But this is basically the contingency. If they students that were working together received a score of 80% or higher on that quiz, they received extra credit points. And I, as the instructor, decided to use extra credit just because, I don't know, I just wanted to play with the idea of making quality points extra credit where it couldn't necessarily hurt their grade, but it could help their grade. So some students they indicated anecdotally some anxiety around, oh my gosh, my grade is dependent on this other person. I don't know how I feel about that. So I wanted to see if it was still an effective reinforcer, and that the extra credit could have a meaningful impact on their grade, but it wasn't going to necessarily hurt their grade. Here are the results. We had 17 total quizzes. Again, the quizzes were worth a total of 10 points. You'll notice here that the crescent is the quality points and the square is the no quality points. Scores over the course of the 17 quizzes were slightly higher during the quality points contingency. although the last two data points, which I'll talk about, are not as, the scores when the equality point contingency was in place decreased. Also, here are cumulative results. So you can see that 73% of the cumulative questions answered correctly during the quality points contingency versus 67%. So there's a slight difference between the two conditions. Got 5 minutes left? Okay, so we'll be quick. So a couple of the reasons why this might be the case. A lot of the information was cumulative. So in terms of the students that in which their quiz scores decreased as the semester went on, especially during those last 3 data points with the quality point contingency, they really had to know all of the information over the course of the semester. It was they were cumulative type quizzes, so as a result, potentially get more challenging as the semester went on. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to jump to a third and quick final study. The third study, considering we've heard during the conference today the importance of online education, how e-learning and the use of technology is so important. One of the things that my colleagues and I wanted to do was say, how the heck can we do interteaching in an online format, let alone do research? And one of the ways, when I used to be on the faculty at Utah State University, and when I was there, they used Canvas, which is similar to Blackboard, and they used Adobe Connect, which is similar to Wimba. But basically, the big thing is the pair discussion. How do you have pair discussion with a person that's located in another country, versus whether it's asynchronous or synchronous? And what we did was, first of all, we wanted to look at what was the impact of pair discussion. So as that component in particular, instead of quality points, said pair discussion, and do it in an online format, since that's never been done before. So what we did is I taught a graduate class of 25 students, and I was off campus. It was synchronous online, so we met for 2 hours at a time, 2.5 hours. And what we did is we used Adobe Connect, and so the students were placed in what are called breakout rooms, online breakout rooms. So back to, Judy and I, we're in an online breakout room. She's located in Massachusetts. I'm in Utah, but we're able to have a pair discussion of the prep guide in the breakout room. And then what the students did was submit a record sheet online, so I got the feedback that way to develop a clarifying lecture, and then they also completed a quiz online. Here are those general procedures, which I've described. In the interest of time, I'm going to go on. Here's the data. You'll note that this was an average quiz score, or it was out of 30 total points. We had 13 quizzes. This line across the middle is 27 out of 30, which is an A. You'll note that during the pair discussion component, the scores, there was definitely some overlapping data and not as favorable of results as we would have liked. A couple of reasons why that is. We're very short on time here, so I'm just going to skip. Well, actually, this slide noted that 22 out of the 25 students did, in fact, score higher during the pair discussion component. 3 students did not. Okay. A couple of reasons. We did have social validity data that indicated that students did, in fact, prefer pair discussion, which was the major component that we were manipulating, versus not having that component as part of interteaching. A couple discussion questions. There was the open book nature of quizzes. How it's not the same as not having any material in front of you due to the online nature of the quizzes. And then also some technology challenges were certainly the case, where students are having difficulty connecting and having that pair discussion. Anecdotally, I just want to know this, students indicated that they really liked it because they got to actually interact with students that they previously wouldn't be able to. So that was a really encouraging component. I know I'm pretty much out of time here. Here are some future directions. There's a lot of areas of potential research in the future for interteaching, considering it's still a fairly new teaching methodology. I just want to highlight those. For example, further component analyses. There's been some component analyses, like the ones described on quality points and pair discussion, certainly more, as well as replications, in terms of enhancing that generalization of interteaching to different types of classes, different subjects, undergrads, graduates, students from other countries, etc. All right, so I'm out of time here. Any questions? We'll probably, are we going to have to wait for questions? Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And then also we can do the social hour starts at 4, so.
Okay. Well, all right, that sounds good. Is this your presentation?
All right. Hi, thank you everybody for being here late today. I'm going more to share some of my experience as in the classroom as I try to incorporate different type of document sources in order to try to grab students' attention and to engage them. What I'm trying to show is how different type of documents, written, non-written sources, can be used in order to for students to embrace these sources, to recognize themselves in the topic, and to hopefully be more engaged. So sometimes some notions that can be boring, a little bit arid when we just talk about it. Again, what is a source? What makes a source? What is a written source? What's a non-written source? What's a primary, a secondary source? I found that by using different type of documents, I can reach out to the students, and generally speaking, for them to grow as critical thinker, they do need to critically examine the documents that they read, watch, review. So understanding what's a source can be challenging, as we know. Most of the time students have, some understanding of what I mean by that, which is always reassuring. But the definition of what's a primary, secondary source can vary depending on the topic that we examine. For instance, if I decide to, usually textbooks would be considered as secondary source, but if I decide to look at how a specific topic has been taught over a specific time, over a given time period, then my textbook will become my primary sources. So in order to engage students and to make the conversation not just more interesting, but also more practical, and for them to have a better understanding of what it is that I'm trying to convey to them, I try to use a number of non-written sources. So first off, as I'm sure that everybody has this discussion, should we use Wikipedia or not? And as most people, I say, well, let's not use Wikipedia, not necessarily because information are bad by the nature in Wikipedia, but much more because of the anonymity of the document. By not knowing really who's been writing, who's the author of the document, it prevents from a deeper conversation about the nature of the document and what it tells us and the information in this document. By using non-written source, I found that it's a very good way to grab students' attention towards the nature, who's the author. and to also show them that the author is really a produce of his own history, his own society, her own backgrounds, and all of this, of course, cannot be cannot be seen as we use encyclopedia. So that's not just for Wikipedia. So I'm going to use a number of examples that I, based on stuff that I've been doing in the classroom to show you, how I do this. I think that by different sources can tell us about the history of a specific place, but in relation to other cultures, other peoples, and places. So I teach in the Africana Studies Department, and the type of classes that I teach are in connection to the African continent, so that's why you're going to see a lot of examples based on this, but I mean, this is applicable to many different topics. So how to look at a culture from the perspective of that culture, how to understand that there are different perspectives when you talk about history, that depending on the authors, you will have these various perspectives. So a good example of this is the Epic of Sundiata Keita. So I put there the cover of the book. It's a small book that is fairly well used in the United States when people teach African history. It was written by, so it's the Epic of Sundiata is an old oral tradition that tells us the history of the foundation of the Empire of Mali by Sundiata Keita, who's considered to be the founder of the Malian Empire in the 13th century. So several centuries between the time when this epic has been first told and today. So Jibril Tamsir, who's a Guinean scholar, is the one who recorded the words of a griot, who's the person who's orally in charge in West Africa to pass down history. And he's transcribed this in this book, the Epic of Sundiata Keita, which was first published in French in 1960 and translated in English as Sundiata, an Epic of Old Mali, in 1965. So I usually use this text as we examine some of the states that existed in Africa, in West Africa, before the transatlantic trade. And one of these important states is the Malian Empire. So the epic provides a way to access history from an African perspective. It also provides a great opportunity to discuss oral traditions versus written ones, and to place this debate in context by examining how the transatlantic trade and the colonial period have devalued oral traditions. There's also a question of authorship that leads to an interesting conversation about who's the real author of this book. Can Nyan, who's just transcribing the words of the oral tradition, can he be considered as a rightful author? In the case of an oral tradition, generally speaking, who's the author? So these are obviously complex questions that, to answer, generally speaking, and I found that the use of other sources promotes a better context for discussing the Epic of Sundiata. So for instance, to underline that the book that we read in class only gives us a limited understanding of what is an oral source, we listened, for instance, to excerpts of the ways it is usually told in context by the griot, by the oral, historian. So I'm just going to give you a quick example of what it is that we can listen to. If it works. Okay, so just to give an idea of how history can be taught in other contexts. In West Africa, when this oral tradition is, when the griot tells the story of Sundiata, it's always with music and even dancers sometimes. So that's that's another perspective on how to tell this history. There's also an important movie documentary that I'm not really going to show you here because there's not so much time, that I use, and this documentary, what happened? Okay, all right. And the documentary is also looking at the epic, but from a contemporary perspective rather than just presenting the story. It's examining issues of modernity versus tradition, Western culture versus African culture. So that's a good complement also to the story. As students, okay. So this documentary, I'm not going. Is made by a filmmaker by the name of Danny Kouyaté, and I like to use that also in connection with music by a current Malian singer, Salif Keita. And what is interesting is also to see the connection between Salif Keita's name. Students may notice, or I would point them to the connections between the similarities between his name and the name of Sundiata Keita. And that's allowed me to talk to them about a specific social organization in West Africa, which is the one of the caste system. And Sundiata Keita, Salif Keita, that I'm going to show you here quickly, performing in French, as I said, is from Mali. And as you can see, or maybe not very well, he's an albino, so he had to face a lot of prejudice in his own society. But one of the main prejudices that he had to face was his decision to become a singer. As a Keita, as you see that, the same last name as Sundiata Keita, he's coming from the ruling family, and he's not supposed to be a singer, which is the role of the griot. So that's another opening to other aspects of African history. Another also good application I found of the use of digital sources is to get a better grasp of historical debates that can be complicated to look at and sometimes to comprehend. But I always insist that history, ways in which we write history is really informed by where we come from, the time period we live in, etc. And that historians have been arguing over a number of topics. So as we cover, some debates that we cover are the historiography of ancient Egypt, the ways in which African history has been written with comparisons between before and after the transatlantic period, scientific racism, etc. A good example of that is when we look at a civilization in southern Africa called Great Zimbabwe. Western Europeans, when they found this, they realized what Great Zimbabwe is. You have a huge, massive enclosures that have been built in the 13th century with no mortar, no foundations, I wanted to show you some, but I don't think we have time. And I think it's very important in that especially for that, for instance, that student can see what it is that Western Europeans saw and how they to understand why they reacted by saying that this could not be couldn't have been built by Africans. So let's see. I'll show you quickly what it looks like.
Here.
Of
the Dark Continent, white colonizers
So you
claimed
see this
Africa's
great
lost civilizations for
gigantic,
white ancestors.
Stone buildings.
There is
and there are
definitely
number
a
of those,
deeply
in
ingrained
Southern
idea.
Africa. Another important point about using this type of sources is that also it shows students different historians. For instance, in this specific documentary, you have a number of African historians who are who give their interpretation
The great
of
vanished, yet the
so I just wanted to show you
the great African
before,
civilization
after. Okay.
born these stories,
Well,
but
okay, so it's also a way for them to have access somehow to other voices, to see other scholars. So I see sources as a way to reinforce a specific point, but also as a way to provide good tools to study points that are sometimes quite complex. But above all, it's also a way for students to understand that although they have to follow specific rules when writing their papers, they can also enjoy a certain form of freedom, that non-written sources are relevant, and that they can also use things that they don't necessarily think of as a source. This is something that I've used also, these kind of sources in online classes, and in addition to building interaction among students, it's also provide them with materials that are less dry, and usually they enjoy that. I had a lot of good feedbacks from nursing students who were questioning, the textbook that they have. They realize that actually, behind the data that they use, they are, a number of work that has been done in order to get to the statistics, for instance, that they study. I found also that by allowing students to embrace non-written sources, they often better recognize themselves in the topic that they study. For instance, music generally is something that most students do enjoy. And I sometimes design papers that allow them to use that type of sources. So a good example of how also music can be used also as I teach history. For instance, during the slave period, there's a number. It's a good way to look at instruments. There's a number of instruments, especially drums, that we can look at in a secular and a religious context. Why is it that some of these instruments, especially drums, were considered as threatenings by the enslavers? The transatlantic trade, which is a very difficult topic to deal with, so many centuries ago. So it's very difficult for students to have to picture sometimes what happened. And I have to say that movies that are not necessarily always giving a good idea. So, but I do like to use, for instance, a quick excerpt from Amistad. I'll just show you like 1 minute of it. Which is short, but usually it's very graphic. That type of documents also leads to good debates and also response papers. As I use music also in relation to the transatlantic trade, for instance, in the movie Amazing Grace, there's the main black character is played by Youssou N'Dour, who's a Senegalese musician, and he plays the role of Olaudah Equiano. Equiano was taken as a child in Nigeria, and he was enslaved. He was able to buy his freedom and write a book that was really key to the abolitionist movement. So he's there in this movie. So that's also another way for them to look at other characters. And we can also connect. I don't think I'm going to show you that right now because time is so short. But I also show them Youssou N'Dour as a singer today and other works that he's done. So for instance, he went to Gorée, which is off of the coast of Senegal, a place where Africans who were enslaved were taken before they were taken on board of the slave ship. And there in Gorée, Youssou N'Dour, well, starting there, but that's the starting point of his documentary. He filmed a documentary about African musical legacy to the Americas. So it's really important also for students of different origins, African descent, but not only. I mean, these are good tools I found to for people to not just recognize themselves, but also better embrace the topic. It helps to improve a dialogue across race and gender. Okay. I think maybe I just, it seems to me that to include those non-written sources, it's a very important way to reach out to students of various backgrounds and to make them understand that themselves, they are also producers of history. All right, thank you.